feel like I'm at a restaurant. I should say good morning just as everybody takes a bite of food. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our Domestic Violence and Intimate Violence panel and forum of 2019. My name is Aaron Teston, student, member of the CJ Club. And good morning, everyone. Welcome to our Domestic Violence and Intimate Violence panel and forum of 2019. My name is Aaron Teston, students who helped put this on. Dr. Johnson as well for allowing us to have this forum and panel. And for those who are here for extra credit and were voluntold, that was my first experience of 2017. Please be open to our intimate and domestic violence panel today and information that is being shared. Our belief is this panel is impactful and informative as we hope to show a perspective from our diverse community. Domestic and intimate violence affects many different lives and worlds. It covers all cultures, socioeconomic statuses, and relationships and ages. This topic is not a simple one. In fact, it's extremely complicated. But our hope here is to make it a little more clear. It's a broad-ranging topic that is not a simple one once again. And our theme this year is Partners in Advocacy. In our discussion today, we'll be covering a very sensitive and emotional topic. Our goal is to heal, not hinder. We understand that this topic could trigger an emotional response, as it did for me in my first one. If this does happen, please, we embrace the fact that we may need to go collect ourselves and do so, and we can be there for you if need be. Please enjoy our food and beverages, as you already have. It's a great treat. Once again, I would like to thank Student Life and all the other resources that enabled us to have these fantastic treats. We'll be starting. Our first speaker will be the wonderful and very informative Megan Irby.
Testing. Okay, that works. Awesome. So my name is Megan Irby. I am the Pierce College Fort Steilacoom counselor, faculty counselor. There's 3 of us total for the district. I'm primarily here at Fort Steilacoom, and I'm on the panel as well, so I'll go a little bit more into my role here. But Bobby asked me to just do kind of an intro of what intimate partner violence is, so we're all on the same page. I think everyone is in here has different levels of knowledge and experience, and so it's good just to do basic 101. I want to make sure people know I don't consider myself necessarily expert in this field, although I do have previous experience. I used to do basically a college education program back at CU Boulder, my undergrad, where I did gender and sexual violence education, and that included intimate partner violence and domestic violence. I also have worked at a domestic violence shelter, and then here on campus I often work with students who are dealing with different levels of intimate partner violence. So in terms of the term intimate partner violence, I prefer that over domestic violence, but it can be interchanged. So I'm going to be using that today. IPV is how I refer to it. There's several reasons I prefer that. The biggest thing is, I think, domestic violence. Sometimes there's an assumption that it's folks who live together, folks who are married, and folks who are heterosexual. I think intimate partner violence shows that there's a whole range of how this plays out in relationships, and you don't have to necessarily be living with someone, you don't have to necessarily be married. It can happen across different demographics, like he said, and also within same-sex relationships. So that's where I'll be speaking from today, but just know it's the same as domestic violence. So in terms of just what I'm going to be reviewing, just real quick in terms of what is IPV, what type of behaviors go under that, and what's all included in that. There's a whole range of behaviors in a spectrum, an umbrella, if you will. And there's also different cycles of violence and abuse, so you kind of know how it plays out. And it's not going to be linear for every relationship, but typically what we kind of see in that cycle of violence. And then there's also a power control wheel, and I think that really gets into the systemic issues that are in these relationships and why it's very complicated. People have a really tough time leaving these relationships because of the power and control that's involved in these relationships. And then just to bleed into our panel today, I'm just going to touch on considerations for marginalized populations. This is a difficult topic for everyone and a difficult way for survivors to access support, but I think it's really important to look at the demographics and the intersections of our identities and how that impacts people's ability to get support. So this is just a really great basic definition to get us all on the same page in terms of that it's abuse or aggression involved in an intimate partner relationship. Now, IPV can also be seen as children that are experiencing it within the relationship, and so there's family members that are also impacted. Typically, though, it's between intimate partners, and once again, it can be spouses or former spouses, and so I'll go a little bit more into that. And I think a lot of people can use different definitions, but I found like this was the most broad, and I really liked that it talked about that there's levels of severity. It's not always going to look the same. It's not always going to be as chronic as others, and so it's just good to keep it as broad as possible. So I think when we think about IPV, we often think about the physical. We think about the physical violence, we think about the bruises, the black eyes, the broken bones, the hospital visits. That's typically the questions that people are asked to in terms of the actual violence that is perpetrated on them. Although I have found in my counseling rooms over the years that the other behaviors are really what has a lasting effect. I have heard over and over again survivors say, you know, the bone's healed, right? But what they said to me and what they did to me and how they took my life away from me for a period of time is really what impacted me the most. Now, but there's also long-lasting physical stuff. Oftentimes there's traumatic brain injuries, there's other things that go into the physical part. So it's not to minimize the physical part, but I think sometimes we just see that in terms of what's on TV and what's kind of talked about as more the physical. So obviously the physical can be the whole range of different behaviors. And usually it gets worse and worse as the relationship progresses. And then I think the sexual violence part is one that we overlook a lot of times, and we don't consider that in consensual relationships, sexual violence can happen. We've changed a little bit, right? Our society has opened up the reality that rape does happen in marriage. That is a thing. Rape can happen in consensual relationships because maybe a partner doesn't want to have sex that day. Or maybe somebody doesn't feel comfortable with certain sexual behaviors, but the partner forces them, manipulates them to do certain sexual behaviors. So the sexual violence part is just one of, it's included in the physical, but I think that's really important to note that that happens in consensual relationships. And then the stalking piece is something that, again, we kind of maybe think about the boogeyman in the bushes stalking us, the person that we don't know. But oftentimes there's stalking behaviors even before a relationship starts potentially, and that person doesn't know, and throughout the relationship, and especially when the person starts to try to leave, the victim is trying to leave, that person will increase their stalking, will increase the behaviors to track that person because they can sense they're losing control. So they will show up at people's places of employment, at school, at family members' homes, etc. Tracking devices are really common, private investigators, things like that, to make sure that they have full control over that person. And then the psychological aggression is what I have found to be the longest lasting for folks. Once again, this isn't true for everyone, but I can speak from the clinical lens, and what I see in the counseling rooms is I hear over and over again what they said to me and what they talked to me about and what they said who I was as a person, and they blamed me for it. And I believed them over time because that's what they do. The psychological aggression is a process of isolating the person from their support systems and then telling them over and over again the things that are bad about them, why they're flawed, why it's their fault that they're being abused. And that's pretty common in terms of manipulating that person. And so I think shame is probably one of the longest lasting things I've seen from survivors of IPV is, why didn't I leave sooner? I wasn't strong enough. So a lot of self-blame because society tends to victim blame. And also just the reality that when you get told every day you're a bad person and horrible words that I'm not even going to repeat here, but you can imagine the things that people say to another person to tear them down. And oftentimes, I have found that survivors of IPV had previous abuse in their life. Maybe they grew up with IPV in their household, and it became almost a norm, and they didn't know anything differently than that. So a lot of times, there's normalization of this, like, oh, well, he just gets upset at times, and I just need to be nicer, or I just need to do this. And so I think it's just really important to know that the psychological part is so insidious, and so deep, and so difficult for people. And then we go into the financial control. This is where it becomes very difficult for folks to leave. So you have the emotional piece, you have the psychological piece, but then you have financial control. So the abuser finds a way to make sure that person's either not working, or if they are working, very limited, and they have full control over their paycheck. They usually are an allowance. They get very limited amount, even to take care of the kids potentially. So there's this process in which that person, logistically, you can't leave. Emotionally, you feel like you can't leave. And as we know in our society, there's not going to be enough resources out there for everyone. So there's limited shelter space. There's limited resources out there, right? And I'm going to go into the statistics in a minute, but you'll see that this is a problem that it's an epidemic, right? And it has been an epidemic. And so when people are looking to leave, there's not just a quick fix. And when they have no money and they have no ties to anything else, you can imagine you're pretty stuck, right? So now there's other things that we can go into, but I think this really hits on the main types of behaviors, and our experts that are here today, the panelists, can talk more about this as well in terms of what they see, because I think it's becoming more nuanced with social media. There's more stalking that can happen, especially in dating violence, which I'll go into. So in terms of the scope of the problem, this is just one of many statistics. Once again, I don't consider myself an expert, so I looked at various sites and tried to see what was I seeing predominantly as the most common statistic. And I think that it's important to keep in mind that any of these statistics are going to be hard because a lot of people don't seek help for a variety of reasons. And also it might not even be termed as domestic violence or IPV because maybe there wasn't as much physical, so they're not marked the same way. And there's just so much stigma. And it's really important to highlight that if 1 in 5 women and 1 in 7 men were dealing with a disease, a cancer, something that was taking the lives of this many people, we might have a different reaction, right? And I think part of this is due to misogynistic thinking in our world, but also if you look at it, men are impacted as well, right? And so I think there's also a lot of shame that goes into any survivor to go and get help. But men are socialized to be the aggressor, right? They're the ones that are socialized in a certain way to protect themselves. And if they're not able to protect themselves, the shame to go get help. And that there's a lot of assumptions that men can't be abused by women or by other men. And that's just not true. The reality is people are impacted across the board. And especially with sexual violence too, you'll see that it's 1 in 5 and 1 in 12. So I think it's just really important to look at the scope of this and that this isn't just one person here and there that this happens to. And I think he mentioned in the beginning again, the demographics, it goes across all demographics. It's going to look different for those people depending on their race, gender, social, economic status, all of that. So the domestic or the dating violence is, I think, more and more talked about. I think that it wasn't, like when I was in high school and stuff, this wasn't something that was really talked about. I think that this has been more and more talked about, social media. Once again, I feel old when I say this, but I don't really know all the social media stuff out there. I get lost in the Snapchats and all of the stuff that's happening, some TikTok thing, all of those things are out there. And so there's different ways people can access, right? And so I can only imagine the level of cyberbullying that goes on. Well, dating violence is very similar. They find a way to slowly control that person. And so it usually starts with jealousy red flags. So a boyfriend or girlfriend might be really jealous that you're hanging out with the opposite sex if you're straight. And they don't want you hanging out with those people anymore. They don't want you actually spending time with friends anymore. You spend too much time with those people. You need to spend time with me. It's kind of an initial red flag. I think all of us have jealousy within us, right? I think that can be somewhat normal to some degree, but when it gets to the point where you're controlling the other person, telling them they can't wear makeup, they can't dress a certain way, you don't want them hanging out, you want to know where they're at all times, that should raise a red flag. Unfortunately, it doesn't a lot of times. I think sometimes they see it as, oh my God, they really love me. They are so obsessed with me. They love me so much. And I think we're told a lot of fairy tales about what love looks like, and I think that that's broadening as we get more progressive as a society, but I think there's a lot of elements of this that are normalized way too much. So I think it's just important to look at relationships, especially for young folks, when their brain's still developing, they're gonna be more impulsive, there's more hopeless romantic feelings at that time. I remember that time, so I'll just speak from my experience. I remember that very much so, right? And so I made probably decisions in relationships I wouldn't now. So I think that it's really important that we educate our young folks in terms of what dating violence looks like and what's not normal and how to manage those feelings of jealousy. I think we also need to attune to the person that is having these out of control obsessive feelings. Like, how do we help them be more confident in their relationship? And I think that's a large part of it. So the cycle of violence and control is something just to keep in mind in terms of how it plays out day to day. So oftentimes the violence and the aggressive behaviors don't start until a little bit later in the relationship. You might have some dating violence red flags, if you will, but I have heard so much the abuse didn't start until after we got married. 2 months after we got married, this is when it started. And it's usually gradual, right? Not all the time, but usually it starts with little things. So I think I have a little, boom. Okay, tension building. So tension building can be very, like I said, gradual and almost insidious, where you start normalizing, like, oh, they just nitpick. We just fight a lot, you know? We just have a very passionate marriage. We just argue a lot. But maybe there's more name calling as it goes on, more putting down, more just aggressive behaviors, and it might not be physical quite yet, but there's more intimidation, more threats, and that's going to build and build and build until an event. Usually an event can last maybe just a day, a couple hours, or maybe it lasts days, weeks. Kind of depends on where in the relationship it is and how much the violence has escalated. Where's the time? So I know where is there a clock up in here? Okay, cool. So once the acute explosion happens, usually that's when the most physical violence part happens. It'll usually turn into apologizing, gifts. I promise I'll go to counseling, I'll change, I'll never do this again. And the abused wants to believe that. We want to believe that we're with someone we love because we saw good parts of that person, right? We saw that they were a good person. So we believe they're going to go to counseling. We'll drop the protective orders. We won't pursue calling the police next time, yada, 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 right? And then it goes back to tension building again. And what tends to happen over time is the honeymoon starts to disappear, tension building is constant, and it's always walking on eggshells, and there's just explosion after explosion. Now, not all the time, but that's typically what is seen. And then just the power control wheel, there's lots out there. So I'd recommend Googling it if you're really interested in knowing more about these. But I touched on some of the elements before, but I think it's really important to look at a couple of the things that are on here. So the pets and property is one to highlight. If you have pets and property, threatening to hurt the pets, threatening to do something to the pets, and abusing the pets usually. And also property, damaging property, taking things, destroying things, things like that. And then another thing I liked about this wheel was the spiritual and cultural. Using someone's religion or culture against them, or to excuse their behavior, one of the two. So taking cultural stereotypes out of context and using it as excuse, or using scripture as an excuse to control that other person. But once again, there's lots of different examples of the power and control wheel. And I think that it's important to look at, it's almost like if you were at the center of that and you're balancing all these control, manipulation tactics that the person is doing. You're isolated, the person has made sure to cut out all your family and friends, and then you have all this going on. It explains why people don't just leave. So the question often is, well, why don't they just leave? I mean, there's kids involved, why don't they just leave? I don't understand, why would you be with someone like that? Well, as you can imagine, as I kind of laid out today, it's very complicated and very complex. And oftentimes people want to leave, but they don't know how, physically, logistically, how to move. And then also there's an emotional, psychological piece. If you are so shamed and you have been beaten down emotionally, you don't think you deserve to leave. You don't think you have anyone else. It's sometimes like us against the world. And that's what the perpetrator often does. The abuser allows you to feel like, if I don't have this person, I don't have anyone. Even if they're horrible to me, they're the best option I have right now because I don't have anyone else. So that's why people often don't leave and can't leave. And it's really important to keep in mind that the threats of violence and the threats of killing someone if they leave is real, right? We see it, unfortunately, way too much, murder, suicides on a pretty regular basis. And so that's the most dangerous time for people is when they're leaving, they better have a really good plan because they've tried it before. And usually, I don't know if this is still true, but on average, I think it's like 7 times average before they actually leave successfully. And that's if they leave successfully, right? It might end in death, and it often does, unfortunately. So, and then I just think it's good for us to take a step back and look at the victim blaming that happens with IPV, sexual assault. Well, she asked for it. I mean, she was pushing it, da 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 da. We often do that with sexual violence. Well, we do with IPV too, and we do victim blaming. So I think we need to turn the tables a little bit and look at the systemic barriers and the priorities, right, in our communities in terms of how we protect folks. And even though men and women are victimized, because women are more often victimized, I think that just goes a lot back to misogyny, right? And then that leads into marginalized populations. And I think it's just really important to note a couple things, and I think our panelists will obviously have way more expertise than I do, so I just want to touch on it that all of us have a hard time calling the cops, or most of us do when we're feeling victimized. But when you're a person of color, especially African American men and women, if you're calling the police and there's been historical violence from law enforcement, that's probably the last thing you're gonna do. And also there's an element of protecting your abuser. You don't want them hurting you anymore, but you also don't want the police coming in hurting them. And there's also a lot of stereotyping that happens, and you don't want that to be perpetuated. And so it's protecting the culture, protecting the stereotypes, and also the reality that you're not going to probably get as much support in certain communities, which is just the reality because of racism. And then I'm just going to touch on LGBTQ. Do we have Rainbow Center? Cool. So they'll talk more about this, but I think it's just seen as often mutual. If it's a same-sex relationship, that's just mutual violence. And then also if you're a trans individual and in a trans couple, if there is EMTs or police that come and your gender is androgynous or ambiguous at all, there's a lot of trans violence, refusing to get to receive medical care, like they will not perform CPR sometimes, they won't help a trans person. So I think it's just really important to note that it gets more complicated, right? But hopefully this gives everyone a good overview, and then we will go into a survivor story soon, and then the panelists will go deeper into what I shared today. So that's it.
During the process today, we'll have a survivor story, and then our panelists give a brief description, maybe even a bigger description of what they do and what they have for information to give. So please be receptive of that. It's a great gift to take with ourselves. Then after that, there'll be a time for questions and a detune time. And with great pleasure, I would like to ask Nikki if she would come up and share her story with us. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for having me, Pierce College. This was a very, wonderful blessing to do this. So, Megan gave a great overview, touched on many things that happened within my life. I am a survivor of physical and sexual assault from my ex-boyfriend. So I begin my story about 4 years ago. I was coming out of a long 15-year marriage with 2 beautiful children. And I didn't know anything about online dating, so as Megan kind of talked about the cyberbullying and the social media and all that, that became reality to me. I began doing online dating in a site where I met the abuser. At first, he was interested and we just kind of talked here and there, but he continually focused on me, harassing me and continuing to hit me up and talk with me. And so as you can tell, again, like Megan talked about, the continued stalking and continuing wanting to reach out to get my attention. He lived about 2.5 hours up north, so I live in this area right now, so there was very much different of mileage. So I began dating him the first year on and off, but again, it was the very much push and pull. I had really bad kind of anxiety about dating him. I don't know, something didn't feel right. But as his continued persistence and my going through my own grief and loss and, and guilt for my children and stuff and leaving my marriage, he was that support person for me, at least I thought. And as time goes on, he wooed me with all the gifts and all the wonderful things that, you see in an intimate partner abuse cycle, just showering me with lots of roses, flowers to my work, showing up. I began driving. He made me drive up there many times during the week. I was traveling. I was waking up at 2 o'clock in the morning where I had to be to work at 4, so I was waking up at 2, traveling up to see him. And then, so the first year that I was dating him, it appeared like he was the greatest thing for me. Just very supportive, got along with my children. And the cyber stalking and the cyber bullying, that was consistent. We both had Facebook pages, so he was on my Facebook page and would write things, and we would go back and forth and argue and go off of each other's pages. So you see a lot of that back and forth, and very much the power and control wheel. So I'm going to take a drink, excuse me, so give me a second. So this is kind of the courtship and how they gain control of you. Now, I'm a mental health counselor, so for me, it was that idea of like, how could anything like this happen to me, and how could I find myself in a situation where I'm not being able to recognize red flags or see signs, or and a lot of my friends and family, they all said, what are you doing? Are you not seeing this? Like, this is really dangerous. And I ignored the signs. It got really complex with our relationship because he found out within the first year that he was a father of 2 identical twins, that he had never had kids, so he was having kids at 46, and obviously he was not in a relationship with this individual that he had children with. So the relationship got very challenging. I became kind of a surrogate mother to these children because he ended up getting temporary custody. So this became a way, if anybody is familiar, became a way to really reel me in and keep me kind of more hostage in the relationship. I felt a lot of guilt because of my own separation from my family and kids, that I really just felt like these 2 infant babies had no other stable person in their life. Their mother was a meth addict, and their dad was, he used alcohol and drugs and stuff like that as well during our relationship. So this became, like I said, you have all the signs that, Megan talked about, the bullying, the shame and guilt, power and control. So during the times that we had a lot of fights, he would do situations such as frame it so that he was sitting on my chest and holding my arms down at one time and screaming that I was hitting him, which I was not, to frame himself because his uncle was in the other room and the door was shut. We were in the bedroom. So situations like this, he continued to escalate in his behavior with me. So then we get towards the end of our we've now, ventured in being about 2 years together. I decided to move in with him to help raise these 2 little baby girls who didn't have a mom. And I lived with him for about 3 months. And then I set up a day where he was at work, and I called my mom, who's here in the audience with me, and we moved me out of the house back into an apartment by myself. So at that time, I was attempting to try to leave and get the strength up to be away from him, but he did not allow that. So now we're into about 2.5 years of being together. He threatened to send nude photos to my work. And so some of these behaviors you see as well. This was really detrimental for me because I work for the state. So calling the police and having things like this on my record was not something that I wanted. And then, as I said before, the shame and the guilt for leaving these 2 babies was something that really held me in the relationship. So I won a trip to Peru, probably about a week before my final assault that landed my able to walk away from the relationship. We traveled to Peru together, and this was due, I didn't really want him to go, but he, again, persisted in power and control and told me that, that he was going to take the money and he wasn't going to give it back to me. And so we ended up traveling to Peru, and I was really scared, actually. But I just, went about went about the vacation, enjoying it the best I could because it was on my bucket list. So hang on one sec. The very last day that we were in Peru, we went to Machu Picchu, and he proposed on Machu Picchu to me. So at this time, I'm going, oh my gosh, like all these emotions ran in my head, and I said to him, you don't even like me, why are you proposing to me? And I was bawling, and I didn't really know at that point like what to do, because I knew if I said no that I might not come home. I knew that there's a possibility like either I might die there or, the Peruvian people, I was scared either way. And I knew I had to come home to my children. So I said yes, and I did not post it on Facebook because I was hoping that I could come home and, be free. And he forced me to post it on Facebook. So now I had to post something that I knew I was going to changed my plans when I got home. So immediately when I got home, we called it off. Like it was that we got home Thursday, I called it off Friday. 2 weeks later, he's still bothering me, texting me, emailing me. I tried to block him, he's emailing me. He started writing me at work, which, working for the state, we're not allowed to have messages like that. So I ended up finally deciding to go to this mutual party, and this was the night of my attack. He had never really, done the extent of what he did that night to me, and I know that at this time I was nervous about whether or not to go, but I figured, I'll go. I'm driving myself. So we met up at a friend's house. It was a football game, and I noticed something odd. He was not drinking, which he's an alcoholic, so it was kind of weird to not see him drink anything. And then he asked me to go to this house because he was a real estate person, so he had keys to like an empty house. So he said, hey, I'm getting ready to move, so will you come check this house out with me? I was like, okay, sure. So he kind of coerced me into coming back to his house, and there was a babysitter who was babysitting the babies at the time. We put the babies to bed, so his children were in the house when I was attacked. They were sleeping in one of the other bedrooms. His children were 2 years old at the time. So, hang on one sec, sorry. How am I doing on time? Good. Before I get into attack, I also want to say that Megan also touched on that abusers will also say that they'll go out of their way to change and everything. So during this time, he also attempted to go to church, which I'm a Christian, so he attempted to go to church and try to woo me that way. He also said that he would go to counseling. He went to counseling a few times, then stopped going. I asked for the bill to see, and I asked for release of information, and he wouldn't give me that. So part of me really struggled back and forth. There are a lot of lies, a lot of deceit, a lot of ways to just manipulate and control. So the night of the attack, can I take this off? Okay. I feel weird doing that. So the night of the attack, as I said, I went to his house, and we started to get into a fight about the babysitter because he had a history of dating 25-year-olds, and he's like 46. And so I got into an argument with him about the babysitter and just the relationship in general, and just kind of trying to say, hey, what are you doing, And we just began to get into a really big fight, and he threw me down on the couch. He threw my phone against the wall, shattered my phone completely. So I couldn't call 911. So if you're familiar, that's obviously kidnapping and not being able to, interfering with you being able to call the cops. He was holding me down. He was straddled over me. At one time, I think I ran into the bedroom. He lived in a split-level home. So he was entrapping me because he would, every time I try to go towards the stairs, he would walk in front of me. He was 6'3", 280 pounds, and I'm, obviously a lot smaller than him. So he was like literally getting in my face. He wouldn't let me leave. He was screaming at me. He threatened. He would tell me that he was going to call the police, and he was pretending like he was calling the police. And then, so I ran into the bedroom, and again, remember his 2 babies are in there. I ran into the bedroom, and he like held the door so I couldn't get out. Then finally, the bedroom is where a lot of the abuse took place. He ended up, I went into the closet. I think I tried to kick him to get him to stop, but when I tried to kick him, he got even more furious, and he's still screaming at me. And I ran into the bedroom, and I tried to kick him. He punched me twice in my back, really hard. And then he dragged me in between the bed and the dresser, where there's only like this much between the dresser and the bed. And I'm laying on the floor, and he straddled my chest, and he said several times, "I'm gonna kill you. I'm gonna kill you. You're not gonna get out of this alive." So as a 280-pound person sitting on your chest with that much space, he is like, I'm bawling, and I'm not knowing what to do, and the only thoughts that are going through my head is my 2 little girls who I may or may not go home to see. And I just thought, like, this is gonna be my last day. Like, I'm not gonna make it through this. And obviously, you never, like, nobody prepares themselves for anything like this. And you never know, like, how you're gonna react, and you never really want to. Like, I mean, I help people on a daily basis, and at this moment, I was feeling like, how do I get out of this? Like, and so he choked me 4 times, sitting on my chest, choking me and telling me he was gonna kill me, and then he would stop, and then he would choke me again. And I'm blacking out, and I'm kind of seeing stars. And finally, at one time, to get him off, instead of the fighting back, because I knew in my head that that probably was going to make him more angry, and obviously it didn't work when I tried to kick him, I put my hands on his face and just said, "You're hurting me, I love you." And he just screamed at me and said, "No, you don't," but he got off of me. But that wasn't the end of it. As many know that, the abuse is still going to continue. So after that, he grabbed a belt out of the drawer, and he chased me around the bedroom saying that he was gonna kill me. He had to kill me, and if he went to prison, that he was gonna find somebody to kill me. When he was on my chest, there was one time that he reeled back and like attempted to almost like smash my face in, but luckily like he did not. Not to say that that was, the situation was bad enough. Then as he's chasing me around, like I said, with the belt several times, I ran into the bathroom and tried to close the door and lock myself in the door. He kicked down the door just like it was open. Like there was no, it just looked so easy for him. And he ended up coming in there, and the first thing he says, "Well, now look what you made me do." And I was attempting to try to get out of the bathroom window but it was a 2-story, and in my head I thought, there's no way I can get out of this. I can't jump off the balcony, I can't slide down the thing, but how do I get out of this? And I couldn't get his phone. He had his phone attached to him the whole entire time so that I couldn't call 911 from his phone either. So this is where the sexual assault comes into play. So he gets me onto the bed, he turns me over, and he, forces sex on me. And then he did it again before we went to sleep. So he finally, towards the end of the night, he ended up laying next to me, and I just asked him, like, please just let me go home, let me go home. And he wouldn't let me leave. He laid next to me and put his hand on my, thigh so that he could feel that whether or not I would leave. And so the next day I left, and I ended up going to the cops and everything else. So yeah, so that's pretty much my story. I think, for me, thank God that I'm here being a Christian. I think that, the Lord, that I am here to be able to tell my story. I know for many of you it's difficult to hear, and I appreciate you listening to me, and just being aware, getting information. So thank you all for your time.
Thank you for sharing and opening up to us. That was a story that I'm sure we can all connect to. Thank you. Before I invite our panelists up, if there's chairs that are empty, please, if you can, move in. We have some individuals that are standing. I see some chairs have opened up again, but don't be afraid of your neighbor. They may or may not bite you. I can't attest to that. If the panelists would please come up and don't leave me hanging at the mic, that would be great. Do you need help? Miss Jackson. That's Jackson. I was going to say, sorry, Miss Jackson. Well, welcome back, everybody. Everybody get a chance to get seconds? I love you too. So now we'd like to take our attention and direct it up front and meet our guests who I am fortunate to sit here and listen to, and I'd like to say thank you again. Ms. Jackson?
Hi, I'm Jill Jackson. I'm the legal advocate at Our Sister's House in Tacoma. Oh, sorry. Do I have to, might have to take this off.
You want to take it off and hand it?
Hi, I'm Jill Jackson. I'm the legal advocate at Our Sister's House here in Tacoma.
Hello, everyone. My name is Stacia Vieira. I'm the Victim Services Division Manager with the Korean Women's Association. I oversee our 3 victim services programs. The main program is our We Are Family Home, or WAF Home, domestic violence shelter, as well as our elder abuse program and our rapid rehousing project for domestic violence survivors.
Hi, I'm Susan Banhedge. I'm a victim services advocate for Central Latino in Tacoma. I also do sexual assault and victim services besides the domestic violence.
Hi, everyone. My name is Yuzuri Hilliard. I work for the Puyallup Tribe as their domestic violence outreach advocate. So I go out into the community and talk about what our program does, as well as going into powwows and being just out and about and trying to get the word out that we're there for them.
Good afternoon. I am Jennifer Caldwell Hoskins, and I work for the Puyallup Tribe also. I work for the domestic violence program as their community DV advocate, so I do a lot of service delivery, court accompaniment, and basically whatever our clients need.
Hi, my name is Lori Lynch. I use they, them, she, her pronouns, and I work at the Rainbow Center. I'm the education coordinator, and I go to organizations and institutions and do education on LGBTQ and gender identity competency, as well as outreach.
I'm still Megan Irby. I am the faculty counselor here at Pierce College, Fort Steilacoom. So I primarily, along with our other 2 faculty counselors, see currently enrolled Pierce students for short-term mental health counseling, and we also do resource and referrals. We're also one of the only folks on campus that are mandated for Title IX. So that means that folks who are currently experiencing domestic violence or sexual assault can come to us, and we can figure out resources and way to get you support and so forth, and then we can talk about how you can navigate the Title IX system and how the Pierce College can support you, but I don't have to report that unless you want to. So that's one of the benefits of being in my role and working with students. But a lot of times I'm referring to folks like this, so I love being here with y'all, so I get more information today too.
Well, everybody's introduced. Joe, would you like to take us through a day and a walk and what? No? All right.
Oh, thank you, Stacia. A day in the life. We do advocacy in 2 parts, family violence. Is it working? Okay. Family violence. And then we do have another component with the legal aspects of family violence, DV, IPV. A lot of victims find themselves in positions where they need to have parenting plans, issues with their divorce, domestic violence protection orders, or sometimes it will go into a criminal sense where there have to be orders of no contact, restraining orders as well. So that's mostly what I deal with on a daily basis, but I also do just regular advocacy where a client will come in, will call, and tell us a little bit about what's going on in their abuse. We schedule them for an intake. They hopefully come in for the intake. Sometimes they just don't show up, which is it's regular. When you're in an abusive situation, your life is not. It's not like you can just sometimes leave and go to this appointment that that has been set without the knowledge of your abuser, hopefully. So not showing up is quite common, but when they do show up, we do an intake process. We discuss what's going on in the relationship. We try to do some education around what's going on in the relationship because it's hard for some victims to understand what exactly is going on with them. They're experiencing something maybe they've never experienced in their whole life. This is sometimes new to them, unless it's intergenerational, at which point they may know what's going on, but they still don't have a name for it. They don't understand why. So we can discuss that. We also discuss what they would like to see for themselves, because sometimes we'll meet people and they go right back to the abuser. Sometimes we meet people that are still in the relationship. They have just had time or secretively during the day to meet with us, maybe to safety plan, maybe to ask us questions about what they can do from a legal perspective. But that usually lasts anywhere from half an hour to an hour. It just depends on what's going on with the victim survivor. Resources are another huge aspect of the intake process. They usually ask for some sort of resources, and top of the list will be housing. Because as Megan was telling us, one of the big things about leaving the relationship is where are you going to go? What support system do you have? Where are you going to get the finances to go anywhere if you can escape the situation? So those are huge questions for someone leaving an abusive relationship. And we try to deal with those through community resources, which are dwindling. And as Megan said, there's not a lot of, because mostly it's financial. Do you have a phone? Do you have a car? Do you have a credit card? Do you have a bank account? Do you have any money at all? And a lot of times that answer is no, 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 no. I mean, they may just have a phone, but it may be being tracked. They may have a car, but they might be being cyber stalked, and there's something on their car where they're being tracked. So all of these things come into play. It's huge. That's just a small overview of what goes on a daily basis. And for me, a lot of it is legal. So I may have to sit with a client for hours trying to piece together what we can put in a declaration for a DVPO. Sometimes they don't get accepted. You have to prove so much. You have to make this story, and this story makes sense, and the strategy that goes into it because of our legal system and the way it views DV, especially women. So it's huge. I have to go to court quite a bit. I will pass the mic because that's just an overview and a very teeny weeny small part of what goes on or what can go on during the day. I will say this, no day is ever the same at all. And the people that we meet and the stories that we hear, sometimes we sit and think, well, that, it's not shocking. That didn't shock me. And then one day someone will walk in and my mouth will drop open. It's just non-ending. So I will pass the mic. Thank you.
So for our domestic violence shelter, it is a confidential emergency DV shelter located in the Tacoma area. So for us, as Jill stated, there really isn't what a typical day would look like. Every day is very different, but I can at least walk you through what it might look like for a survivor who's first entering our program, who gets accepted into our shelter. So we get calls every single day that we do have to turn away for shelter space. We are a relatively small shelter. We are a 7-bedroom, 19-bed facility. And so we generally are at full capacity all the time. When we do have an opening coming available, or if someone is moving out, usually that room is filled same day because of the number of calls, the volume of calls that we get, and other forms of communication, other service providers that may contact us about openings, emails through our website, all kinds of different ways that folks are seeking safety and are trying to get out of that abusive situation. So we do not maintain a waiting list. It really is just first come, first serve when we have a particular room size available. So we would only complete a screening when we know that we have that appropriate room size. So if we had a mother plus 4 children, we would only screen for that room when we had our largest family size available. And so when someone does call in, and if we are screening, for a room, we will let them know that, ask them if they have about 20 minutes or so to complete a phone screening with us. And all of our advocates are very well trained in working with folks who are experiencing crisis, who need assistance with safety planning, who really need that emotional support and validation. It is a really challenging experience to talk to a stranger over the phone and tell them pretty intimate details about violence that you've been experiencing and trying to get help and trying to get safety for you and your children. So we understand that, and we work with folks at their own pace and their own comfort level. However, we do have to ask some really personal questions because we want to make sure that the folks are getting into our shelter are the ones who do need it the most. The main criteria for our program is that they've either experienced a recent domestic violence incident or a violent incident of some kind, or that they are being pursued by their intimate partner, that they are fearful that this person will harm them again, and they need to get away. They need to be safe, have a confidential shelter. And so we'll ask them a series of questions that we can better understand their situation. Most are pretty open-ended. And along the way, we're offering to help them with safety planning, if they want a conversation about protection orders or filing a police report, or any other resources that they may need to access in the moment. We're providing that over the phone. And then once we finish the screening with them, usually we'll be able to make a decision pretty quickly whether or not we're able to bring that survivor in, or if we have other screenings we're working with, trying to decide who to bring in. We do have to choose the highest lethality, so the folks who have the highest risk of being found and harmed by their abusive partner. And those are really challenging decisions to make because everyone's everyone's situation is very unique and very scary and dangerous in its own way. But we try to make those decisions the best that we can. And so then when we accept a survivor into the program, we will arrange to meet them at a safe, neutral location. Since we are a confidential shelter, we won't meet them directly at the shelter. We'll make sure to see what their transportation needs look like, if they have children or need car seats, if they have their own vehicle and will be meeting us to follow us in, or if they need us to provide transportation and drive them in. We'll try to figure out what that looks like. And then once we meet with them, we'll bring in the survivor and the family, and we'll give a tour of the shelter. We will sit down and do an intake with them. It can be a lengthy intake process, so we do try to divide it up. Someone coming into the shelter, as you can imagine, it's an extremely high crisis moment in their life. For many folks, it's the lowest point ever to be homeless and to have just experienced maybe a fairly recent violent assault. And so, we really want to be sensitive to that and address the survivor's health needs or just basic emotional needs that they have. Make sure that they have food. We have a pantry where we can provide food and hygiene items, clothing, just any kind of basic living items that they might need to be comfortable. And then we can complete the intake with them to learn more about their situation and how we can better serve them. And then we offer to them a variety of services that they have the option to choose to engage in some of them, all of them, or none at all. Participation in services is not a requirement of our shelter program. Someone can choose to stay their 45 days in the shelter and not utilize any of our advocacy services, and that's perfectly fine. Sometimes folks just need a space to be safe away from their abusive partner, just to regroup, maybe focus on, if it be counseling services or just establishing some sense of safety and separation, and that's all they want to work on, that's fine. Other folks really want to take advantage of being able to meet with staff, and we have a variety of different advocacy services we can provide. So we do have a housing coordinator. So pretty much from day one, we are working with them to assess what is their exit plan after 45 days, where they will be living, where they'll be exiting to. We also now are really excited that we have our staff who are fully trained in the coordinated entry system, which is the homeless entry point for everybody in Pierce County has to go through the coordinated entry system to have access to a number of housing resources. So we are really excited that we now are the first program that has domestic violence specific coordinated entry specialists, so we can perform the CE assessments immediately upon entering the shelter or within a couple of days, which gives them an access to a number of referrals for rapid rehousing, for example, that could be specific to DV survivors, and other resources. So we're working with them on an exit plan, trying to get them whatever support they might need for housing. As Jill mentioned, that's the number one need, and it is a challenge to permanently house folks in 45 days. Sometimes feels like an impossible task. And there are so many other barriers that come with that before someone can even really assess their housing needs. They might need to take care of mental health or chemical dependency needs, or establish child care, or figure out transportation, or assess a number of legal issues. If they're interacting with the court system, whether it be for family law, for protection orders, for criminal cases that they could be involved in as the victim, any number of issues that may come up that are going to take their time away from being able to focus on housing. But we offer the support if they would like to utilize it at the shelter. We also do have a legal advocate, so someone who will work with them on assessing what those legal needs look like, accompanying them to court, helping with protection orders, referring to other legal services as needed. We have a child advocate who works with all of our children in the shelter individually, and helps with daycare and school enrollment and so on. We also have our general shelter advocates, so who are available to meet with folks to provide ongoing safety planning, which is pretty important. Everyone in our shelter, as you can imagine, is fleeing, is in a pretty dangerous situation. They're being pursued by someone who's looking for them. And as we learned earlier, it is about 7 times that a survivor will attempt to leave the abusive relationship before they can successfully stay away. So a lot of our clients are going to end up returning to their abusive partners, or they may be found. Sometimes we do have clients who are found through our program, and we have to try to relocate them. And so safety planning is an ongoing conversation every single day, especially if there's cyber stalking or any tracking through their phones. We're trying to find creative ways to make sure that they're safe. And then we also have support groups on site at the shelter. If folks want to engage in that, they're welcome to. And then just being a supportive ear to help them through what they're going through. So I think that's all I'm going to say for now. So I'm going to pass it on. Thank you.
All right. So again, my name is Susan, and I'm with Central Latino. Our primary focus is obviously focusing on the Hispanic clientele, but we also work with Native Indigenous. Working with the Hispanic clientele has all kinds of extra things that have to be done, and I am the Department of One. I do everything there. And primarily, of course, I'm working with undocumented folks who are fleeing and have absolutely nothing, including family or friends. So our first, of course, point of contact would be me. And it would always be trying to find housing primarily for the first time out of their home, away from their partner. And generally, if we are lucky, we are able to send them to the shelter, thank God. I've had great partnerships with the shelters locally, both in Pierce County and King County. And so working with these folks who are not only undocumented, are unable to work, and now also are unable to find housing because housing requires social security numbers to be able to get a credit check or a background check. Most can't even get into housing. So it's tricky. I have to become very creative in finding ways to help them not only to stay safe, but also to begin their own businesses or work on the side, either babysitting or house cleaning or whatever I can help them to progress and to finally be able to get into their own housing. I also do the legal part of it, so if somebody needs a protection order, I will accompany them to court, and I will help them fill the paperwork and all that fun stuff and represent them. And I'm not a legal counselor, so I can't really speak in the court, but I'm there, I hold their hand, I pass them tissues, I do whatever I have to do to make their life a little more bearable at that moment. Other services that we offer at Central Latino is, primarily we have all bilingual staff, so it's a safe place for them to come in and just to be able to speak in their language and know that everybody there will be able to help them, even if it's just to read a letter or to learn how to use a computer, how to create an email. Sometimes we take for granted how many things we have to do on the computer nowadays. So a lot of times an appointment with a client could take me 5 hours. I've filled applications before for a job for somebody, and it took me 2.5 hours to get that application filled. So Central Latino in general, while we do everything that comes right from the get-go, where they are currently on leave, living in their car with their kids to try to get them into shelter or to get them into housing. We are fortunate that we have received federal funding that helps us help them start, so we can help them with deposit or with rent or something to get them stabilized. And then at that point, hopefully they'll be working and they'll be able to sustain on their own. Some of the other programs that we have at Central Latino are also, we have a computer lab, and again, that was one of the things I touched on, is that it's so dire to be able to work technology. So we do offer those services to them to teach them how to work with computers. We have ESL classes for second language learning. And then, of course, again, like I said, the bilingual staff is a huge credit to the organization. Excuse me. I will be starting a support group, hopefully within the next month, because there are a few support groups that are held in Spanish. And so that'll give time for the clients to vent and share their story and, just create friendships and extend their knowledge of what they've learned of resources and that to their local victim friends, if you will. So I think I've covered it all, and I love to see, I'm just going to throw that in, all these fresh, young, beautiful faces out there. One of the things that I do is I go around and I teach people about domestic violence, because like I tell everybody, if you are informed, you can help somebody. And I know everybody in this room at one point or another has probably felt or been in a domestic violence situation or has heard about it. So I always tell the guys, even the guys, carry a couple of our cards in your wallet, because if you ever do come up on somebody, you are there to help, and that would be a huge help to all of us up here. Thank you.
Thank you. Again, I'm Yuzuri. I'm going to share my time with my coworker here. I'm going to speak a little bit about our Puyallup Tribe's domestic violence program, what we do, and what sort of services we provide. So for us, we are part of the Puyallup Tribe. You may or may not know we have a reservation boundary which includes parts of Fife, Tacoma, Milton, and a little bit of Dash Point. So we have this dual jurisdiction. So if a person who is native, and not Puyallup, just any native federally recognized. If they're harmed or hurt within our reservation boundaries, they can call tribal police, do a report. We can do a protection order in our tribal court, so we do have a tribal court. So there are certain times where we've got jurisdiction issues between whether Tacoma will show up, whether, you're off the reservation boundary by a block, and so tribal can't come and those sorts of things. So we see a lot of that with people who are calling for services. We do have different jurisdiction issues than some other smaller tribes would have. Because we're within this urban environment, there's a fairly good conversation between the police departments. I'm not saying it's without its problems, but we have a better relationship than you would see at some of the more remote tribes where there's a larger conflict between the two entities. The Puyallup tribe has codes for both domestic violence, human trafficking, and some missing and murdered, so we've done a lot to incorporate better codes, which allows us the ability to prosecute these offenses that are happening within our reservation boundaries. Our program specifically, we work with anyone who walks in our door. So if you're coming into our door and you're a victim of sexual assault, domestic violence, stalking, any sort of trafficking, whether it's job or sexual related, we will help with that. We'll do safety plans. We have a support group every Wednesday for survivors of domestic violence. We do maintain a secure, confidential shelter just about towards Mount Rainier. We do resource referrals to furniture banks, to other shelters if we're full or we're not able to bring a person in. We do education and outreach. We assist with protection orders, both in Pierce County and some of the other counties, as well as our tribal court. For tribal court, we do have some legal advocates where we can actually stand before the court and help represent a client. There's a problem there if that client is actually mine. I can't represent them because we get into some confidentiality issues. So if we're in need of having representation, I would ask a coworker to do it, and I would still remain the advocate for that particular individual. We also do one-on-one advocacy, cultural activities. We will do some transport if we've got some time available to go to DSHS to get a new ID. Many times when a person's coming and asking for help, it's because they've experienced domestic violence or some other sort of sexual assault or those sorts of things. And when they come in, they may have left everything, including their IDs, their, anything that they can prove who they are. And as we've heard before, it's hard to get a job, to get housing, to get anything without these. So we'll step through that process with them. Do we need to call their tribe and get them a new tribal ID? How do we do that? So we will walk with a person where they're at for what they need to do to take the next step in their healing or surviving. Our shelter is a domestic violence shelter. So any individual or families that are fleeing domestic violence, we do have an additional sort of criteria because of our funding that somebody within that situation be affiliated with a federally recognized tribe. So whether it's the individual who's experiencing the domestic violence or the perpetrator who was part of a federally recognized tribe, but we need that affiliation to be able to utilize that grant funding for the shelter. It is an emergency stay 6-week shelter, which means they have 6 weeks to be in our shelter, and during that time we will work with them to try and find transitional housing, long-term housing, help them to get a job so that they can get a deposit to get into their own permanent place. So we'll do whatever we can to work with our clients in that respect. Some of the other services that we provide are not only do we do outreach, but we're starting to do community events that help to bring attention to domestic violence, but also bring healing to the community, because there's a lot of trauma that has been within our community that has allowed this behavior to be part of our norm. So we're having community paint and heal events, community events to celebrate awareness for our missing and murdered Indigenous peoples. That's a big movement that's been started mostly in Canada, but now is being adopted down here. And we're using that also as a catalyst to inform and to remember that if lots of our people end up on the street, and when they end up on the street, they become vulnerable to some other human trafficking or just getting in a relationship for survival, and then having that become a domestic violence situation. So we try to be wherever we can for the community so that they can access us. Many times, the first time we meet a person is at a community event, and it'll be just some questions on, okay, what do you do, what do you do, what do you do? And I'll be like, okay, here's what we do, and this, that, and the other. Then 2 weeks later, maybe they've called the office and said, hey, I just have some questions about safety planning, and we'll go through that with them. So there's sometimes steps to them getting to a place where they want to talk about, okay, I need to flee this situation, and this may be the first time they've asked for that. And then we might go through this process a couple of times, depending on what the situation is, for them to get prepared to leave that situation, whether it's financial, they're trying to figure out that financial component of how do I have a place to stay? Or maybe it's about the kids. I know that if I leave with the kids, it's just going to go crazy. How can we, manage and put a plan together that makes you feel safe about taking that next step? One of the other things that, for our community, we may do, which is try to get them in touch with their tribe and get them back to their support system. Because many of the people who come to our doors, they may be native, but they're Navajo or they're Choctaw or they're something, another tribe. So they've already been away from part of their community for whatever reason. And so we just try to understand whether, if that's an option for them, for their safety to go back home, how can we help them get to there? And then I will pass it off to Jennifer to go into the uniqueness.
Buju Anin. Buju in my language is hello. Anin is I see the light that is you. My name again is Jennifer. I'm an enrolled member of the White Earth Chippewa tribe from Minnesota. I'm what you would call a transplant. I was raised here in Washington State in the Puyallup Reservation boundaries. So even though I'm enrolled White Earth, I consider the Puyallup Reservation my home, and they consider me as one of their family. So some of the uniqueness about working tribally versus what I would call mainstream programs. So I've worked tribally 30 plus years, primarily in the Puyallup tribal community was the majority of my work doing social work. I've been doing domestic violence specifically for the last 10 years. Prior to that, my background is in mental health and chemical dependency counseling, and I saw a lot of domestic violence clients in that work as well. So one of the things that I find in working tribally is if I were working somewhere else, I might have a caseload and I just have people that are coming in, but I'm not going to know them personally, or my coworkers may not know them personally, or they may not be related to me or my coworkers. This is a common occurrence when we work at the tribe because it's a small community, it's a very close-knit community. So when someone comes in our doors, I may already know them. They may know my coworker, they may be related to somebody that's working for us or for another program at the tribe. So confidentiality is key in all areas of domestic violence, but we have to have it even like to another level of confidentiality when we're working at the tribe. We have our own tribal government, which means there's a lot of politics that can come into play when you're working at the tribe, because this individual who just walked in my door, their auntie may be on tribal council. So there may be some expectation by the family that that person is going to get a different level of care than I would provide for someone else, which is not the case. Everyone who comes in our doors gets the same level of care. But it's a different dynamic when we have to sometimes deal with the political aspect that comes in. Yuzuri touched on some of the jurisdictional pieces. So dependent upon if my client is Native or a mother of Native children, we have some choices where, you know, if I was working somewhere else, there may not be those choices. They can choose to go to state court, they can choose to go to tribal court, we can choose to have a tribal officer come to take the report, we can choose to go to their residence and have Pierce County sheriffs come. So there's some other issues that can come into play. We also have families, because it's such a small-knit community, it's sometimes difficult to go into hiding, because where are you going to go? If you're from the community, your partner's from the community, everybody's related to somebody, somebody's going to see you, somebody's going to know where you are. Lots of our clients receive services at the tribal clinic. Well, if say I'm the client and my abuser's auntie is the front desk, well, she's going to know that I'm there. And no, you're not supposed to say that somebody's there, but it just might slip out, oh, I saw your kids the other day, you know. It just makes a different dynamic because of the close-knit ties within the community. Cultural events. There's different cultural events that happen at our tribal school. There's powwows. There's different things that happen where families all come. Well, if we have someone in hiding, that restricts them from being able to participate in their cultural events because somebody might be there, the family might be there, the abuser might be there, unless it's covered in the protection order, which our tribal judges are really good about covering some of those things. And we can ask for those when we go in. I'm also a legal advocate for our program, so when we go into tribal court, we can ask the judge. We have children that are attending the school, we have school events, can you please cover tribal agencies, can you cover tribal events, which are things that we wouldn't necessarily have covered if we were in state court. The history of trauma, so tribal people have a long history of, we have residential school trauma. Some of our families are first generation away from residential school. Their parents were in residential school, could be their grandparents. They were forcibly removed from their families. So they don't have that family connection, those family ties. They may have lost their culture and they're trying to regain their culture, regain their identity. We have children who were taken from their families and adopted out to non-native families before our Indian Child Welfare Act came into play. So they're trying to find out where they belong. They know they belong somewhere, but they're trying to find that. They know they're native, they had that much information, but trying to get that connectedness. So that trauma plays a part in this too, because they're trying to find out who they are. Now you add these other layers of current abuse and trauma on top of the trauma that's already there. The substance abuse is very prevalent on reservations. Native Americans are predispositioned at a higher rate to have substance abuse issues. Distrust of the government, and that goes back to some of that residential school and broken treaties. So if you have a cultural group who doesn't trust the government because of the other issues, are they going to reach out to contact law enforcement? Are they going to reach out and trust that the system is going to help them? So it's more common for them not to trust the system, not to reach out for help, because nobody's going to help them. Or if we involve the system, it's going to make it worse. So by us having our tribal program, it eases some of that, because if they know who's working there, they know a familiar face, they know who your family is, they might have known your auntie, and there's some trust within the community, they're more likely to reach out. There's the relationship. Native people are really huge on relationship. If I know you and I trust you, I'm going to come in and share. So sometimes just that trust piece, or knowing families, it can be a double-edged sword, because they may not come because you know their family, but they might come and talk to you one-on-one just because they do know who you are. Challenges, housing. We've got a tribal housing program, but it's still difficult to get into. 3-year waiting list, Yuzuri says, is our last update. Being able to get into treatment. Once again, the isolation from the community. If we have severe cases of domestic violence to the extreme where somebody has to get their name changed, and they have to change their identity and relocate, and so they've changed their social security number, they've changed their name, they've done everything possible to change who they are so they can relocate somewhere else in the country, and start over and have a fresh start. That's more difficult for Native people because we also have this wonderful little card that we have to carry that says who we are, our tribal identification card. Not all tribes will allow you to change your tribal ID number. So because it's a federal ID number, Native Americans are still considered a ward of the government. We are still owned by the government, so we're required to have a card that proves who we are. And some tribes will not allow you to change that number. So if I were to change my name, change my social security number, change my children's, and we move across the United States, and I happen to belong to one of the tribes that doesn't allow you to change that, and my only means for getting health care for my children is a tribal clinic, the only way I can use services at the tribal clinic is with that tribal ID card. Well, now I'm traced because it's in the computer system that I just popped up in Chicago and used the tribal services back there. So if my abuser is really good and really technologically savvy, I'm a sitting duck. It doesn't matter that my name has changed, my social security number's changed. I have this third piece of identification that may not be able to change. And it's very common that that becomes the piece that's the hindrance. Did I miss anything? No?
I did want to add one thing. The tribe has, they put together a grant and are funding a attorney to help out with Native cases, so that attorney is available, and that we utilize that attorney as well as some relationships with other attorneys to help our clients with their, sometimes it's a parenting plan, sometimes it's a protection order, or whatever that next stage is, clearing an eviction, anything like that. We refer out to those resources to try and help our clients. That was my last.
One other challenge with the tribe, real quick, is when we do have crimes on the reservation, so we may have tribal law enforcement. Not every tribe has a tribal law enforcement, but the codes that Yuzuri mentioned are different with each tribe. Each tribe has to write their own codes, which is they write their own laws. So what might be the law at Puyallup is not the law at Nisqually, it's not necessarily the law at Squaxin Island, and it may not be the law at Muckleshoot. So you've got all these tribes within an hour's drive from here, and they may all look at things very differently. What they can prosecute in their court is different. So you've got different ways at each different tribe for what they can do within their code, within their court. And then if you have crimes that fall under the Major Crimes Act, that all gets kicked over to the Federal Bureau. So there are limitations on what we can prosecute on the tribe. So that will get kicked over for a duration of potentially up to 5 years, that the feds have it to review it, investigate, and prosecute. And if something doesn't happen at that end of that 5-year period, it can get kicked back to the tribe, which is different on the reservation. Thank you.
Hi, again, my name is Lori Lynch. I use they, them, she, her pronouns, and I'm the education coordinator at the Rainbow Center. The Rainbow Center is a LGBTQ community center in Tacoma. We are located in downtown Tacoma. We are open Monday through Friday from 1 to 4. We have 3 crime victim advocates on site that offer services to folks. We are a secure location, so our doors are locked during our all day. The thing that I really want to say about our community is that hate crimes are on a rise currently, and it's what happens for LGBTQ folks is that we also are dealing with, and Megan talked about this a little bit, that we're dealing with homophobia and transphobia, and so we have to be careful about who we engage with to get services and to get help, because not everybody is willing and is able or willing to give us services. And so at the Rainbow Center, what our advocates do is we seek out LGBTQ competent referrals, right? So we seek out LGBTQ competent medical providers and housing programs, so that we know that when community members come to us, that we're sending them to folks and it's going to be safe for them to go and not be re-traumatized by experiencing homophobia or transphobia where they're at, or the services that we refer them to. And specifically with trans folks and gender nonconforming people, our policy at the Rainbow Center is first act is to not call the police, because often the police are not necessarily the safest for trans and gender nonconforming people, especially people of color. So we're really mindful about how we use those resources. And but the biggest thing that we do for our community, for our advocates, in terms of domestic violence, is we refer out to the Northwest Network based in Seattle, which they specifically work with the LGBTQ community. We partner with them. They also provide like recently we did a relationships class and for our community with them, where they came to the Rainbow Center and basically provided a training on how to have a healthy relationship, to kind of take an educational approach as well.
Thank you, everyone, for being here, by the way. I just want to say I just love listening to everyone talking, and just it's amazing work, and it takes a lot of hard work, and you know, it takes a community, and it's really hard, so I appreciate everyone being here. So I primarily work with students here. I do not do domestic violence on a day-to-day basis, but that comes into my room in a lot of different ways. Oftentimes, students will present with other things that they are struggling with: depression, anxiety, you know, not studying, not sleeping. Then they start mentioning things about the relationship. Oh, well, it's going okay, or yeah, he's not that bad. And then they'll start saying more things about kind of what's going on at home. And I'm usually trying to figure out where they're at in that and how they define that for them, but I'll usually say, that's a little concerning, can you tell me more about that? And oftentimes I just had a student talk about basically dating violence and getting out of a relationship and having a hard time cutting that relationship off and educating just on what dating violence is and making sure that it's not normalized. I think it's way too often normalized. And then I help students navigate the Pierce College support system here. If they are seeking resources, I will often refer to a lot of the folks up here and other community resources depending on where they're at, or it's really being creative. A lot of these folks talked about it. You have to be creative with where people are at. Sometimes they're not in a place that they can leave for a variety of reasons, and that's not what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about how do you psychologically cope day to day? How do you find pockets of hope every day? How do you find people that you can connect with that the abuser doesn't know about, so they can have some source of sanity in their day-to-day world? And usually staying in school is one of the few places that they get away. And so we talk a lot about saying that they're going to study, instead they come meet with me. And they're going to go to different groups on campus, and maybe it's actually they're meeting with a provider in the community. So we talk about ways to safety plan. But I primarily just try to help students with whatever they present with and then navigate it from there with them, because it's a combination of short-term counseling and also making sure they have long-term counseling, because a lot of times people come to me and they've experienced abuse from a long time ago and they never dealt with it, never processed it, and then I try to refer them to long-term counseling because I'm limited in my capacity here in terms of seeing students short-term, and if I know there's really intense trauma work that needs to be done, I want to make sure I'm putting that person in safe hands and competent hands, right? And I think also trying to connect them with providers that look like them. All of our faculty counselors are white, and I point that out and I say, listen, like, I get that you might want to go talk to a provider that looks like you, right, and understands the culture. And sometimes they don't. Sometimes they want to see someone different from them, depending on where that abuser came from. And then I'm also part of the LGBTQ community they, them, she, her pronouns as well. And that's a huge part of my role here in just trying to help students be seen who are queer, androgynous, genderqueer, and so forth. So I incorporate that, I think, in terms of just my endeavors here on campus. But hopefully I can just be a resource for students, or if you have someone in your life and you're worried about the relationship there and you don't know how to proceed, you don't know how to talk to your family or your friend that you're concerned about, come talk to me and talk to one of the other counselors here, because we can help you how to have that conversation and how to express concern without alienating that person, because I think it can be a fine line where you don't want that person cutting off from you, but you also want to get them support. So that's generally how my role here incorporates all of this. So thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Janine Devenuti. I'm the Education and Prevention Manager at the YWWCA. How many of you know what the YMCAs do? Raise your hand. YMCAs, what do you do there? Someone say it loud. Exercise. Learn how to swim, stuff like that. So recreation programs, family programs. So how many people know where the YWCA is located in Tacoma? Raise your hands. Far fewer of you. That's good. But the YWCA has been in Tacoma for over 100 years now. And originally, we had a pool there, and a lot of people learned to swim there. When we're doing outreach, sometimes people will say, my grandmother, taught me to swim here. But now it's an empty pool, and it's really creepy. I don't know what it is about empty pools. But yeah, a lot of employees don't really love going down there. But we've been there for a long time. And in 1976, we were the first domestic violence shelter to open in Washington State. So when I go out to do this outreach, it's surprising to me that so many people still don't know what we do there. So I appreciate your time to listen to all my esteemed colleagues here, because we're all in this together. And we're all trying to make a difference for our community, for you, your families, and strangers that you don't even know yet that may become your friends and family. Pierce County has a very distinct legacy in this state that I'd love to change, but per capita, per population, Pierce County has the highest homicide rate of domestic violence in the state. King County might have one or two more deaths, but Pierce County has the highest per capita rate. And we could change that if we all work together. So I want to tell you, please use she, her pronouns for me. I want to tell you about the programs we have there. We're located on 4th and Broadway, and probably a lot of you have seen our mural on Stadium that says Eliminating Racism, Empowering Women. What I want you to know that's very important is that all of our services are all gender inclusive. All gender inclusive. All of our programs that I'm going to be mentioning are open to all genders, non-binary folks, trans folks, cisgendered folks, male, female. Okay, so that's very important. What we know is violence is happening more from male to female, but we don't really know the statistics about how often it's happening from females to males. And why wouldn't men want to say that this is happening? What's your thoughts on that? They're embarrassed? Yeah, and I mean, there's a stigma against this anyway. It's hard for women to say anything. It's hard for anybody to admit this is happening. And until very recently, they didn't have anywhere to go anyway. So what did it matter if they told anybody? So our services being all gender inclusive is a very important part of our services that may distinguish us from other particular programs. So our shelter is a 90-day stay. We're a secure location. We're a confidential stay, meaning the people staying there are not to disclose that they're in shelter. However, it is not a confidential location. It's not a confidential location. And there's a couple thoughts. It's a secure building, but this is happening in our community. There's a shelter right up the street from $1 million condos. You know, there is a need for secure and confidential locations. But for ours, it's known that that's a shelter here in our city. We accept pets. Pets are family members. A lot of abusive partners will threaten family pets. And to be able to bring your pets there is very important. They are apartment style units. You have your own kitchens, your own bathrooms. We had interior designers that adopted these spaces when we renovated the building. And they are some of the most beautiful apartments in Tacoma. They got, on one side of the building, you got water views. These are really nice units. And we know that beauty can make a difference to healing. That when people walk in spaces and feel valued, it's very helpful also to have your own space. How many people have had roommates before? Raise your hand. Did you ever fight over the dishes or anything like that? No, never. Yeah, so in communal spaces, it's still good to have safety and have a shelter and community with people, but man, there was a whole lot of drama going on in our shelter previously because of communal spaces. So to have your own space, your kids have their own space is really important. And people have really appreciated that particular way of doing shelter. We have a 24-hour hotline that you can call just to ask questions. That is also the hotline you would call if you were seeking shelter. I have a colleague here, Sandra, in the back, that has our outreach materials that we did not get put in the notebook here. So if anyone's looking for that hotline number, etc., you can see her once we wrap up. We have children's programs. Our children's programs provide respite care for families that are in shelter. They can drop off their kids if they want a couple hours just to themselves. It's very helpful. Also, they do psychoeducational support groups for children that have experienced the secondary trauma from that household being in a traumatic situation on a daily basis. So that's very helpful. When adults are in support groups, the children can be in support groups as well. We also have a legal program. We have legal advocates. We have a kiosk where you can file for protection orders there at our building, so you wouldn't have to go to the courthouse. We also have a staff attorney. There's far too many people that need legal services. That attorney can't serve every single person, but they do take on cases. So to have that free representation is just priceless. Attorneys are very expensive, so to have that representation is very helpful. We also have free one-on-one therapy. We have a therapist and an intern right now, so people can come there to do one-on-one therapy that have experienced intimate partner violence. All of our services are for folks that have experienced intimate partner violence, not just domestic violence or familial violence. We are specifically for if that took place in a dating or marital relationship. Also, we have education and prevention programs. We come and do events like this. In Tacoma, Pierce County, last year we presented to over 2,000 students with a presentation called Teen Dating Violence, where we go into high schools to highlight unhealthy and healthy relationships. And also we started doing a prevention program in the last couple of years. It's called Healthy Love, and we take it to area high schools. It's a 10-week curriculum where we really get to know the students, and we talk about the foundation of power and control, which is oppression, racism, homophobia, transphobia, sexism. So we talk about those relationships, and then we move into what are the dynamics of unhealthy relationships, and we end with providing skills with healthy relationships for teens. And that's going very well. It's very exciting to be doing that work because, you know, I would like for all of us not to have to be in intervention services. If we are doing our job right, you all will be out of a job. No, anyway, no. That could happen. Let's hope for that. Anyway, we also have in-person drop-in advocacy. Community advocates can meet with folks that just are coming in without an appointment. They're available to talk, provide resources, and advocacy. We also have a housing program. Our housing program is subsidized housing. They are provided with case management. They can utilize it or not. But that particular housing program, the people that are in that program do have to have dependent children. It is not for single adults. But that program is non-term limited, and after going through that program, if the person and families met their goals, they graduate out of that program, and at this point, it could change, but they receive a Section 8 voucher, which has financial stability for a long time coming out of that program. And finally, I want to end with our support groups. We have 5 support groups per week. We have one that is a shelter resident only support group. Then we also have 3 community groups. And the reason I was late, and I apologize and thank you for your patience with that and being gracious with me being late, we just have had the opportunity in the last year and a half to begin support groups at the Women's Correctional Institution in Purdy. And we had that group this morning. So I said, I really want to be there, but we can't not be at that group for as long as we can be. So many, I believe it's over 80%. I don't know the exact statistic, but over 80% of the women that are incarcerated, it has something to do with the intimate partner violence that they experience. So to be able to provide support in there has been a really great opportunity. And I hope to be able to continue to do that because it's a really, really exciting and rewarding program at this point. I want to thank you all for being here. I think we're putting it to questions now. Yeah? Okay.
Once again, I would like to thank the panelists for sharing and giving us the opportunity to listen. Is a great treat for me. If we have questions that you would like to ask the specific panelists, now would be the time to do it. If you don't feel comfortable with that, please meet in private with them. Bobby has a mic, so if you raise your hand, she'll get you. Rick also has a mic. Question up front.
Speedball.
Hi, my name is Amina. I always ask about mental health. What do you ladies do for your mental health? You listen to all these things that are going on with people you work with every day.
Oh, okay. Hi, Janine. I used to work with Janine, so she's one of my kind of mentors from a long time ago. So just wanted to say hi. What I do, I just make sure that because I know my triggers, if I start feeling a little bit like, oh my God, this is too much. Because you can really only, for me, I can only do maybe 2 or 3 intakes a day, and then it starts to be extremely mentally and emotionally draining. So I try to watch that, and when I know I'm getting to the point where I'm getting extremely and emotionally and drained, I go home and I watch a movie and I take a hot bath and I drink some wine and I play with my granddaughter. Anything that takes me out of the world of DV, because you can't, you put so much of yourself into it when you're there that you cannot let it overrun you, because then you won't have anything to give. You just won't have any energy left. And the people that depend on you for advocacy, for understanding, for so many things, for emotional support, then you don't have it to give to them. So you have to step back. You can't, sometimes I'll just say, it's time to go home. And I'll just go. And that's what I have to do, because it is an ongoing battle, and it's not going to get won anytime soon. And so in the industry we're all in, it's a 24/7 thing for women and men that are in these relationships. So, at some point, you just have to close yourself off from it. You have to. And it's hard to learn to do, because you can hear some cases and then you'll take it home with you and run it around in your head to think of solutions for it or what you can do. And it takes a lot to just cut it off when you leave, but you have to. You just have to do it. And it took me a long time to do it. So basically, and at our sister's house, there's a different dynamic for me, because we mostly work with black females, black males too, but as we've heard, it's very difficult for males anyway to come in and ask for help. But that's we help everyone, but that is our major client base that we're trying to help, because of the cultural dynamics of that and the way black females experience DV as opposed to white females. And I'm a black female, so it's very personal to me. But I've had to learn how to do it. I won't say I am successful every single time. I've had cases where I've gone home and through the whole weekend I'll think of it. But you got to do what you got to do to survive yourself, or you just won't be there for your clients, and they need you there. So.
Past or to the next part, part of what we're trying to do this quarter in this forum and this whole week is talk about, that lens that we see things through. And each one of you come from a different agency that deals with a primary group of people that don't look like me usually. And you just mentioned it there. You primarily work with African American or black women and men, and that's different. Is there any way each one of you can take like 1 minute and talk about how is the primary clientele that your mission is there for different than what I might see as someone who just sees domestic violence on Lifetime TV?
Yeah, well, we work with black females specifically because of racism. I don't know any other way to put it. When you move through life and you have to deal on a daily basis in a racist society that we live in, we live in a racist society. And people of color, specifically black women, because we're considered to be the most impacted by that. It's an everyday thing. You wake up in the morning and you deal with it as soon as you walk out your door, sometimes before you walk out your door. You're not safe from it anywhere. You can't shield yourself. You can't hide. And if you're dealing with abuse as well, that's just a whole nother added stressor and pressure on you. But you don't want to, like it was said earlier, law enforcement, no. Probably not the best place to go for you. The medical community. It's historically known that the medical community has used black women, black people, black women specifically, for their own agendas, and it was racist. And so, by and large, historically, black people don't trust the medical industry. Black people don't trust the government, period. End of sentence. So, and I don't have to sit here and explain that one, I know. Everyone here is a student, you're in college, you should understand the dynamics of slavery and how it affected everyone in this country, specifically black people. And there are black people in this country from all different walks of African diaspora. But when you come to this country, you are in a racist country, and your race is the first thing someone notices about you, and the stereotypes that go along with it. So when you're in a domestic violence situation, you have a lot less resources, and usually racism will trump that. Will trump sexism, it will trump the domestic violence. Every single thing race will trump. And so that's what keeps black females in that suppressed area of coming out and telling or looking for help, all these factors. So when our advocates work with the population that we have, and when it is a black female, because like I said, we help everyone, but that's just who we focus on because of the needs. So we have to understand that. We have to understand those dynamics that are in play there, and those are the barriers that we have to work against. So it's extremely difficult because there's children involved many times. There's governmental agencies involved. There are problems with employment because racism is employment. It's in housing. It's at DSHS. So all these resources that we have to use, we have to put another lens on them, and it's another barrier to get over, and that is racism. Any questions about that? Thanks.
So the Korean Women's Association first started in 1975 as a sort of social club for Korean women who were married to American service members. And so they were married to military members, and they were living in a community that they really had a difficult time navigating, didn't have a lot of social support or access to resources. And so it was a group of women who originally met to help support each other with some of the cultural barriers that they were experiencing. Then they quickly learned how prevalent domestic violence was and a lot of the relationships with these women. Also, they needed support with immigration assistance and food assistance, social services, signing up for benefits, any number of supports that they were lacking in the community. And so the group formed and became larger and has really now become quite a large multicultural, multi-service human service agency with a variety of different services, from in-home care to community and behavioral health to social services to our domestic violence shelter. And so really it was put in place to help serve Asian and Pacific Islander community members who didn't have the same social supports that were available to the mainstream community. And so when the WAF Home Domestic Violence Shelter first started in 2004, it primarily was for Asian and Pacific Islander survivors who were fleeing domestic violence and needed a safe space. And since then, the shelter has certainly evolved. We do serve any and all demographics, folks from different races, ethnicities, religious backgrounds, cultural identities. Anyone is welcome to access our services. However, I would say the largest demographic that we do serve would be the African American community, Hispanic community, and Asian and Pacific Islander community as well. And so we are consistently working with folks who are from marginalized communities, people of color who really do struggle with some of the access to the same services or culturally sensitive services that maybe they've interacted with systems before that have been filled with racism and sexism and homophobia, and they have not wanted to interact with those systems again. And so we do have bilingual staff members of different languages who will work with folks, and even if we don't have a staff member speaking that particular language of someone in our program, we'll work with interpreters. We will work as much as we can to help learn how to serve their unique cultural needs, from providing culturally specific foods, clothing, if there's any particular holidays that they celebrate that we want to put up decorations or to acknowledge in the shelter. We really try to take all of those efforts to make everyone feel welcome and included. And we're partnering with all of the organizations here, as well as others in our community who specifically are serving different cultural demographics, and so that we make sure we are providing those referrals to services that are really meeting the needs of the clients that we serve.
So at Central Latino, obviously, probably the biggest dilemma that we have, obviously, is with the new immigration policies for refugees and immigrants. So that's been a huge hurdle for our program. Just, again, dealing with trying to keep them safe. And, again, when you're an immigrant, the last person you're going to call is the police. And I've been seeing more and more that the victims are ending up in jail or picked up and put into jail overnight or whatever, rather than it being the abuser. So yeah, the new policies have really affected our demographics, and that's been an ongoing battle, trying to find ways, like I had said before, to place them into housing or into work, or even trying to get their documentation in order. Many times they're afraid to come out because of the fear that they will get deported. And most will not call the police at this point because the husbands or the wives or whoever the abuser might be at the time will say, well, I'm gonna call immigration on you if you report me. You can't leave the house because I'm going to call immigration. So that's probably been one of our biggest barriers at this time, is the new policies, as well as the changes with being able to receive benefits if you're undocumented. So I'm going to keep it short and sweet.
So I think Jennifer talked a little bit about this, but there was some adds I wanted to make. One of the things, and Jennifer has lots of experience in DV and has been doing this for quite some time. I've been doing this for about 3 years and came from a whole different industry. But one of the things that I've seen is that when we have somebody come in through the door and they're asking for services, whatever those services look like, this is most likely not their first experience with domestic violence or sexual assault, whatever they're coming in for. They've had experience, whether it was as a young child seeing relationships or violence happen, whether it happened in school, whether it happened in an early relationship, but they've come through a cycle where this was normalized for them. And so when they've come into our door, as I said, it's sometimes just to get information because they're starting to understand that I don't need to be hit, or I don't need to be talked to that way, or I'm concerned that my children are seeing this, and that can be a huge catalyst to come into the office and find out what resources they have and what are their choices, and if there's a way for them to get themselves in a safer place. One of the things I also see is that financial control is a large part of the DV that we're seeing, whether it's the individual victim who is getting money either from their tribe or for something else, but the money is being taken away and controlled by that other person, or whether they're not allowed to work and they're not allowed to have their own income, so that they're trying to figure out how do I move on to that next stage if I don't have access to a job. I've never had a job because I've been in this relationship for so long and I haven't had the opportunities to build that sort of history, that job history and that sort of thing. So those are big challenges and barriers that I know that we deal with quite often.
So a little bit of history about our program. Our program was started about 20 years ago. Prior to that, domestic violence wasn't spoken about on the reservation. It wasn't something that was discussed. You had disagreements, you had fights, you had whatever else was going on. But it was about 20 years ago when the tribe recognized that domestic violence was an issue on the reservation and that we needed to do something about it. So at that point, Tribal Council pulled an individual, our director, Billy Barnes, and said, you need to go make a DV program. And so she was a one-person show for quite a few years, and then she was able to get a half-time advocate to help do some events and help with transportation for the women's group that started. And we have grown. We now have added the shelter program 10 years ago, which we have 7 to 8 staff that do just solely shelter work, and we have 6 of us in the main office, I believe, right now to do this work. But it started out with somebody having an assault on the reservation and it hitting Tribal Council. So it was one of those who's related to who things, who got affected, and a decision got made. Thank Creator for that we're able to do the work we do now. But it was initially due to one incident on the reservation. It was you didn't talk about it before. What happens in this house stays in the house. The family will deal with it. Something called reservation justice. So one of the other dynamics with domestic violence on the reservation is when we do have people that they become incarcerated or they're in the system, we're the invisible population. We're not documented correctly. So many of our people, when they get involved in the system, they're labeled as white, they're labeled as Hispanic, they're labeled as anything but Native. So it's really hard for us to get correct data on domestic violence with tribal people because we don't exist. You don't talk about it. People don't want to talk about the atrocities that happened to Native Americans. The history books don't share it. We were the last population to become U.S. citizens, even though we were the original people. We were the last ones to have prohibition enacted upon us. We were the last ones to get voting rights. So lots of these things that people take for granted as just, what our rights are in this country, we as the first people had to fight for those rights as well. And then once we get them, then we're invisible. So that's one of the things I see in the system that is one of the challenges that we face is fighting to have our voice heard, and the fact that some of the tribes are now recognizing domestic violence. So it's becoming more of our reservations are adding domestic violence services because it's being recognized on the reservations. So I think that's the big thing for us is having it recognized on the reservations that it does exist. And then being able to get our people documented in the systems correctly if the systems are engaged. But it's a fairly new, so like Janine said, they were the first shelter program. They've been there for over 100 years. We've only had DV services here on the reservation, at the Puyallup Reservation, for 20 years. Some of the other reservations are just now getting services. They're just now getting advocates. 10 years ago, I worked at Nisqually. I was their first DV advocate because they didn't have one. I was working in the chemical dependency program, and they said, we need a DV advocate. We know you have experience. So they had me go take the course at the Y and get certified as a DV advocate so that somebody could provide services to that particular community and get some help. So that's one of our challenges when I think of tribal people is that it's so new in providing services. And I do want to answer the original question, which was what do we do for self-care and how do we deal with this? So part of our training at the Puyallup Tribe is that we are all required upon hiring that we go through the 30-hour training at the YWCA. We are required to go to the Sexual Assault Center of Pierce County and take the basic sexual assault awareness training. We've also, a bunch of us were required to take vicarious trauma training, some of the best training ever, because It is true. We do carry a lot of this with us. Even though we try not to carry it with us, it's not something we want to do. We all do this work for a reason. Most of us all have our own experience with domestic violence, whether that was personal, familial, whatever it was that brought us to this field to do this work. So I live an hour away from work. I choose to live on Mount Rainier because it gives me some downtime. And my personal self-care is on my way home. There's a tree halfway there. And, huh? Oh, keep going? Okay. All right. So halfway home, I get to hang up my work and I pick up my home life. And then I can focus on home. I have to do a mental shift. For me, it has to be a conscious effort because it's really easy to take it home, especially when you know these people and you know who you're working with. So I have to do a mental shift. It has to be a conscious effort. Now, if I have a client in crisis, there are days that doesn't happen. We do have an on-call hotline at our office, so someone else, everybody takes turns answering that phone. So if it's not my turn, I can turn it off and go home. If I have a client in crisis, that's not always the case because they're going to call. They want to talk to their advocate. But otherwise, I switch gears. I hang up my work, I pick up my home life, and then I can be engaged and ready for home life when I get there. I have 2 very active children, so once I get there, there is no downtime. We are doing football, we're doing soccer, we're doing cheer. Right now we're in competition cheer. So it is from the time I hit the door until we go to bed. In the morning, I have to hang up all of that activity and pick up my work and then get ready for the day. So for me, it's a halfway point. And then to de-stress from all the chaos at home with all those sporting events, I have this crazy crafters group, which oftentimes ends up being a group of us advocates getting together, and we have downtime and craft time, and we just do our own self-care. It's getting together for food, supporting each other. We have our own little hotline to, oh my God, it's been such a crazy week. Can we get together this weekend? So we support each other with our own little networks in and amongst, because we all have crazy busy lives in addition to our jobs. Self-care is huge. You have to do the self-care. Average burnout is like 7 years for a social worker. So if you don't do the self-care, you'll lose yourself. It's super important. So thank you for asking that question, because I'm sure these ladies all can tell you it's a crucial part of how we survive.
I just want to add to part of Jen's. So we kind of check in with one another a little bit, So if I see she's having not a bad day, a very stressful day, and there are things piling up, is there anything I can take off your plate? Can I go get you lunch? Do we
really
need
good
to
at that.
smudge, just to cleanse? And then I also participate in this crazy crafter thing that we do. Hopefully we do it often enough, but I don't think we do. And then for me, I also have a cat that is the most loving thing, and when I walk in the door, he makes me, check in with him and love him, and just, taking the time to switch gears into, I need to care for this cat, I need to love this cat, I need to do these things. I also go to we have a culture department that puts on cultural activities on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Even when if I'm not with a client or doing something with a client, I will force myself to go and do that, just to force myself to switch into some other gear. So taking those opportunities, because it's easy for me to go home and go, I'm just gonna cook dinner and go to sleep and not even, but just trying to make sure I'm keeping track of myself and doing things that are restorative for me, and one of those is crafting.
So at the Rainbow Center, working with the LGBTQ community, there's a lot happening right now for our community that is going to be impacting us for the next year. There are a couple cases at the Supreme Court that are going to determine the legality of discriminating against LGBTQ people, and so there's a heaviness that is happening in our community, and it impacts every aspect of the work that we do. And so keeping so that's a barrier or part of the lens that we're looking at working with our community, is knowing that the discrimination that we're facing in the world, the fact that we, can be fired in so many states for being LGBTQ. So there are all these things that we have to hold while we're working with our community. And I just think like right now we're just in this place where it's like there's a lot of change that potentially could happen for us, and it's scary, and it adds to the stress. And the thing that is important to remember with the LGBTQ community is that a lot of us don't have family, we've been kicked out of our homes, we've been disowned, and that is real, right? The average age for a lesbian, gay, or bisexual young person to be, for them to be homeless is 13, and is 14, and for a transgender young person is 13. So, because they can't live in their house anymore, right? Because they've been kicked out for being LGBTQ. And so that's also another thing that we often don't have the historical, familial people around us that somebody might naturally lean into. Well, call your mom, call your dad. It's like, well, maybe their mom and dad isn't actually acknowledging their existence anymore. And then also, depending on where in the U.S. we are, we're really looking at our like physical safety of resources, and that's why I mentioned that at the Rainbow Center we're really intentional about how we refer people and what resources we refer people to, because there are institutions that are services that are supposed to help folks who need services, but that actually are not safe for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and gender nonconforming folks. And we have to be really mindful of that, because again, we don't want to re-traumatize somebody by sending them somewhere where they're going to face discrimination because of who they are. At the Rainbow Center, one of the things we do around self-care, because we also, for instance, I go out and I do education, and when I'm doing education, I often get hostile feedback from people who don't like me, right, because I'm queer. And so one of the things that we have at the Rainbow Center that is set up is every Monday we have what we call our RC Culture meeting. And it's a time, we meet every Monday for an hour, and we really talk about our culture in the office and what's going on. So if advocates have had clients that have been challenging for them and they need to share, they need support. If I've done trainings where it's been challenging and I need support, it's been a really nice space to have that like this is an institutional self-care that we're doing. I also, as a queer person, I have built up a community around me of people who I can lean into, and so when I'm doing something and I feel that I'm holding on to it, I have a group of folks that I can call and reach out to and say, this was really hard, and I just need to say this was hard, and I'm having some feelings about it, and they hear it, and they just support me, right? And I also agree that that's the self-care, the having people, the putting myself out there and reaching out to people to say, I'm doing this work, and this is really challenging, and I'm taking it personal, and that's, I need some help, is actually part of what makes me better, right, at the work I do. So we try to keep that institutionally, that like, hey, we're going to support each other because we know that we're fighting the good fight, and so we're going to lift each other up all together.
Yeah, I feel you on that heaviness. I feel you on that. It's crazy. So I'll go back to the self-care piece. Why she reacted about the tree thing is I was in a classroom and she asked that exact question, what do you do for self-care? And I said, one of the things is when I drive home, because I'm about 45 minutes from here, is every tree I pass is someone I'm leaving or a story I'm leaving behind for the day. And so, some days there's lots of trees, some days there's just one or two. And it's nice in the fall because they're popping and out there. And And then going home to my pit bull boxer puppy is probably, the thing that sets me back into that mode. Because, she loves me for who I am. She doesn't do the things that humans do that really get to me on a daily basis, and the stories I hear about how humans treat each other is hard. So I think animals for me is, you mentioned your cat. My cat isn't that friendly. I mean, it depends, right? Yeah, okay, just bring it, bring it. My cat decides, once she's well fed. But I think just having chosen family, like you were mentioning, I have people in my life that support me and see me for who I am and embrace me, and people who choose not to, whether that be biological family, whatever, they're not in my life. And I think boundaries, I think folks have brought up, you gotta leave at home, you gotta have healthy boundaries. You gotta decide that you can only do so much. As a licensed mental health counselor, the stories I hear, I just want to wave my Harry Potter magic wand and be like, boom, all those memories are in your pensieve, and then you don't even have to worry about it anymore. And obviously I can't do that. Haven't got into Hogwarts yet. But I think the reality is you focus on what you can control. You focus on how you were there that day for someone, and you were just a human being that treated them well. And if at the end of the day, I'm a human being that treated someone else well that day and made them feel seen, made them feel safe, then all right, cool, that's a win for me. And my population are students, and students I try to see through a culturally humble lens as much as I can, and try to recognize my blind spots, but also learn where they're coming from. And I think students are balancing so many things, and they come in with a lot of different stories and intersects with all of what was talked about here, So I try to be really active in the Pierce community and really try to understand what I don't live every day, and then also support those that I do get being queer in this world right now, and trying to explain to people I could get fired just for being me, right? And people don't understand that. And so I think it's just, layers of self-care in terms of community support, Reiki massage, animals, nature, and then true crime TV. I know that sounds weird, but true crime, it's amazing. I don't know. I don't have to fix anything, and then I learn more. So, I'm one of those true crime junkies. So that's my piece.
I'm going to take a little bit of a different approach, because I'm going to not so much talk about my own self-care, but to talk about the YWCA in general, trying to support all the employees that are doing this difficult work. So I don't know how many years ago it was now, maybe 5, they started a wellness committee. And being on the wellness committee, they create events. Like just last week, we had a autumn, I don't remember the title, Autumn Fest, I don't know. And people brought food, and it was delicious. And we had an hour of playing games, just sitting there and talking if you wanted. So being supported by the place you work is very important too. I, as a manager, I try to be very conscious of spreading the workload throughout the 3 advocates that I have the privilege of managing and being co-workers with. And that's checking in. Hey, how are you doing? What's going on? And those are the things I think that are important in the agencies, in the institutional part of our jobs, and the culture. I know my colleague back there, Sandra, her and I like food, and she is such a perfect model of taking care of herself with food, and I'm not that great at it. And so sometimes she's like, Janine, before we go to Purdy, she'll be like, did you eat breakfast today? So, just being that support system for each other too. We all have our own individual things, I think, but to be there supportive for other people you're working with is important.
Well, that was a lot for us to take in, I know, but the beauty of this is now is the time for us to wrap up, and the opportunity for a one-on-one is there. So I would like to thank the students, the panelists especially, invaluable information for myself I know that I took in. the faculty, eLearning for helping do the video side of this. And with that, I would like to have more food. I too find wellness in food, so thank you again. Once again, can we please give a big applause for our panelists?